Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and we're going to talk about how Dungeons & Dragons has become the main catalyst to push Netflix forward in the streaming wars, and how tabletop role-playing game, the tabletop, and also by extension, the tabletop role-playing game industry as a whole, as an industry, is involved intimately in the streaming wars. Let's talk about this. All right. So, I think about Dungeons and Dragons at a very deep level, and when you start thinking about, and when you're constantly thinking about D&D, you see D&D everywhere, right? You see Dungeons and Dragons everywhere because it is everywhere. People have no idea how deep the political, cultural, and religious impacts of Dungeons and Dragons are in the world because it's American specific, and the reality is the entire world is really America scratches its butt, and everybody in the world is like, "What happened?" That's the way of it, right? We are the central nation in the world now, right? And things revolve around us, and the reason why is freedom and liberty. We have actual freedom, we have actual liberty, unlike a vast amount of countries, right? Like who increasingly are under despots, and America is not. Our people are truly free. And we just spout money and cultural influence because we're so baller and awesome. There you go. All right, and the reason why we're talking about that is D&D is truly an element of Americana, right? It's like Coca-Cola. It's like baseball, right? It's something that's genuinely American and has an American feel in every single, way. It's just truly incredible. All right, so let's get all the way there. All right. So how do we, so how is Dungeons and Dragons forwarding Netflix to be the absolute titan in the streaming wars, right? And the current victor, right? Well, Stranger Things done. Like you've already heard me spout about how important Stranger Things is. It's hugely important. But that's not the only place. Right now on Netflix, there is a very important show called Cyberpunk Edgerunners. It is brilliant, and highly recommended. It's an over 18 show if you're under 8. And the reason I say that is we have a group of dungeon masters who are 12 to 18, or 12 to 17 that should not watch this, right? But if you're over that age, there's an amazing show called Cyberpunk Edgerunners, right? And so I start watching this thing, and I'm not thinking about Dungeons & Dragons when I'm watching Cyberpunk Edgerunners. And frankly, I didn't even remember that there was, when I started it, I didn't even remember that there was a major period in tabletop role-playing game history where Cyberpunk was a very popular, massively successful, not at the level of Dungeons & Dragons, but for an indie game, massively successful tabletop role-playing game, right? So I'm watching Cyberpunk Edgerunners, and this thing is important, right? It's beautifully animated. It has very, very good music that Netflix paid for. This thing cost $100 million if it cost a dime, right? Maybe it was $50 million, but this was a very expensive show. Everything in it is quality. And you know how you know that? It's made by Trigger. If you don't know, Trigger is the anime studio in the world, and anime is spiking through the roof in popularity right now. Same with manga, right? The young people are all over anime and manga, right? So this is the premier Japanese anime studio, Trigger, who did Gurren Lagann, who did Premiere, who did just Little Witch Academia, like huge successes, right? Oh, and recently did the Star Wars, and actually did an episode of Star Wars anime on Disney Plus. And the reason why is the streaming wars are on, right? And Disney Plus most people think Disney Plus bought the newest season of Bleach, right? Like there are huge fights going on for content, right? And D&D is at the heart of all this, right? So Cyberpunk Edgerunners, right, is a D&D show, and I'm going to tell you how, right? Okay. All right. So basically Cyberpunk Edgerunners come on, and the credits roll, right? And I'm like, ooh, Trigger. I know this is good. And then it says Cyberpunk Edgerunners is based on a world created by Mike Pondsmith. Who is Mike Pondsmith? Mike Pondsmith is the most prominent, most successful, most creative tabletop role-playing game designer that has ever been on this planet, with no exceptions. He has surpassed, and the thing is, the reality is, as a person of color, he has massively, surpassed, like, the white guy who makes Zweihander, right? Like, he's got 10 years of achievements to even remotely reach Mike Pondsmith's level. Mike Pondsmith did Dream Park, Castle Falkenstein, was one of the key critical creators for our Talasaurian, which was an entire tabletop role-playing company that is probably the pinnacle of all indie tabletop role-playing games in the 90s. They did Robotech, and Mike Pondsmith was at the heart of it. I think he may have even had some ownership in our Talasaurian at one point. Like, he did things that no other person of color has been able to match, right? And Ajit George and everybody who worked on Radiant Citadels, like, the race is on, right? Like, person of color achievement within the tabletop role-playing is a bracket. We're all watching it. We're all rooting for more person of color victories, right? But Mike Pondsmith was throwing it down in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, right? And actually then he got his comeuppance and received real money, real salary to work in the video game industry. But he was throwing it down in TTRPGs for a long time, and he was incredibly impressive, and he is brilliant. Guess where he cut his teeth? Guess where he sharpened his wakizashi and his katana? Dungeons and Dragons, sucker! Forgotten Realms and Oriental Adventures. That's where he got the skills to write Cyberpunk 2020, which is the world that Cyberpunk Edgerunners is on. And Cyberpunk Edgerunners, top 10, right? Top 10 on Netflix. And guess what? Netflix dominates the streaming charts. You know how I know this? Because I watch Grace Randolph, and she goes over the charts every week. And the other streamers struggle to put one or two items on the list, right? And it is HBO Max, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus have entire weeks where the entire top 10 for all streaming across the board has nothing but Netflix, right? And Netflix got there by making the biggest streaming show in the world, the absolute template that every single streamer is trying to match, Stranger Things. And Netflix is drumming out top tier content that is directly birthed from Dungeons & Dragons greater creators. And one of those Dungeons & Dragons greater creators is person of color, Mike Pondsmith. You know why he is one of the greater creators? Because Gary Gygax and Lorraine Williams hired him to be that. Because Dungeons & Dragons was progressive from the gate. From 1974, it was all over the 1983 Saturday morning cartoons. When you think of a Dungeons & Dragons team, they're like, we want you to think of females. We want you to think of people of color. It was inclusive. It was progressive. And Gary Gygax was incredibly inclusive and progressive. He handpicked the first female CEO for TSR and for the entire tabletop role-playing game industry. And he handpicked Mike Pondsmith because he saw incredible talent, right? And now Mike Pondsmith sets the bar for POCs in TTRPGs. Dungeons & Dragons is the fuel you put in your streaming vehicle to make it go, right? Everybody's like, oh, Scott, Dungeons & Dragons is as important as you always say it is. It's involved in billion-dollar wars, multi-billion-dollar content wars that absolutely directly impact politics, culture, and religion. And if you don't understand that, you're not paying attention. All that is my humble opinion. What's yours? What is your favorite product that Mike Pondsmith created? And I'm really curious, what do you think is a person of color who has either matched Mike Pondsmith or is about to? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.